In a city gripped by cold and hardship, an elderly, homeless man named Samuel risks everything to save a young girl from danger, sparking a wave of compassion that unites a fractured community. As Samuel's forgotten past comes to light, he reconnects with the daughter he thought he'd lost forever. But can he truly rebuild a life shattered by guilt and time? And will forgiveness be enough to mend the wounds left behind? Watch as this tale unfolds, revealing the power of hope, second chances, and the courage it takes to come home again. The wind cut through the city like a whisper of cold steel. It was the kind of night where the warmth of a home seemed a distant luxury, and the streets echoed with loneliness. Samuel, an elderly man with deep creases around his eyes and a patchy, snow-dusted coat, huddled under the eaves of an old bakery. His only companion was the carved wooden bird he kept in his pocket, its wings smooth from years of his touch. His eyes caught the silhouette of Amara, an 8-year-old girl with springy curls that peeked out from beneath her knitted cap. She walked beside her mother, who clutched her phone as if it tethered her to sanity. Amara's laughter rang out, a small bell that pierced through the icy silence and stirred something long dormant in Samuel's chest. He watched as they passed, unnoticed, the warmth of their lives moving away like a fleeting dream. Suddenly, a clatter from the alley drew his attention. A figure, shadowed and intent, moved closer. Samuel's pulse quickened, and he forced himself to stand, his limbs aching with a chill that gnawed at his bones. He saw the glint in the man's eyes as Amara, now lagging behind, stepped toward the sound of broken glass. "Hey, stay back!" Samuel shouted, voice hoarse yet powerful. The man's eyes darted from the child to Samuel, weighing his options before slipping into the darkness. Amara turned, eyes wide and full of questions, just as her mother realized she had wandered. Jasmine, Amara's mother, rushed over, her face pale with panic. She dropped to her knees, pulling Amara into her arms, her voice trembling. "Don't you ever do that again! Do you hear me?" The sternness in her voice cracked under the weight of fear. Amara nodded, her small body wrapped in the tight embrace of safety. Jasmine's gaze flicked to Samuel, who stood a few paces away, breathing heavily, the exhaustion evident in his posture. For a moment, their eyes met, and Jasmine saw something there, an echo of the gratitude she felt but couldn't quite voice. Her brow furrowed as she noticed the ragged scarf around his neck, frayed like the edges of his story. "Thank you," she whispered, the words almost lost to the wind, but Samuel heard them. He nodded, the gesture small and restrained, as if he feared acknowledging kindness might break him. Amara peeked over her mother's shoulder, her wide eyes fixed on Samuel. She took in his weathered face, his eyes that held shadows of both storms and sunlit memories, and the faint, carved bird poking from his pocket. "Mama, who is he?" she asked, the innocence in her voice softening the frost that lingered between them. "He's a friend," Jasmine replied after a moment, realizing she didn't have a better answer. Samuel's lips twitched upward, a fleeting smile that disappeared almost as quickly as it came. The street fell back into its rhythm as people hurried past, their scarves pulled tight against the winter air. But news travels swiftly in small neighborhoods, and by the next morning, whispers of the homeless man who saved the little girl began to stir. Samuel didn't think much of the night as he sat back in his makeshift shelter, the events playing over in his mind. He wrapped himself in thin blankets and huddled into the corner where the stone wall provided the only semblance of warmth. The memory of Amara's curious gaze, however, lingered. It reminded him of his own daughter, now lost to time and regret. "Why did you do it?" echoed a voice in his head, his own voice, burdened by the years. The wooden bird in his pocket felt heavier than usual, its silent wings pressing against his palm as if it, too, questioned his motives. The next morning, Samuel was awakened by the sound of small feet. He blinked, adjusting to the soft, pale light of dawn. There, standing just beyond the reach of his makeshift bed, was Amara, bundled in her oversized coat, cheeks pink from the cold. "Hi," she said, her voice tentative but brave. Samuel sat up slowly, wary of how fragile this moment felt. "Hello, little one," "Mama said you helped me last night." She tilted her head, curiosity radiating from her. "Why do you live out here?" Samuel's eyes dropped, searching for an answer that wouldn't burden a child with the weight of adult failures. "Sometimes life takes you places you don't expect, but that doesn't mean you stop trying to find your way back." Before either could speak further, Jasmine appeared, slightly breathless. "Amara, you can't just run off like that." Her eyes softened when she saw Samuel sitting there, not the shadowed figure she had hurried past so many times, but a man whose quiet strength had saved her daughter. She stepped forward, placing a brown paper bag next to Samuel. "Thank you again," she said more firmly this time. Inside, Samuel felt the stirrings of something long abandoned, dignity. As days passed, the story gained momentum. People who once avoided the man on the corner now left small tokens, food, mittens, or simply nodded with newfound respect. Samuel, once invisible, became an unexpected symbol of silent protection in the neighborhood. But Samuel didn't yet know that the storm was not done testing him, and neither did the community that would soon be drawn together by what would follow. Winter deepened, its chill biting harder, as Samuel's story spread throughout the neighborhood. Children whispered about the guardian grandpa, and adults glanced his way with a nod of acknowledgement that warmed his heart, even as the cold seeped through his thin layer. Samuel hadn't felt this connected to the world in years, yet it was Amara's visits that anchored him most. She brought questions, stories about school, and sometimes just her quiet presence, sitting beside him on a worn piece of cloth. One afternoon, Amara skipped over, cradling a thermos that released puffs of steam. "Mama made soup. She said it's for you." She handed it to Samuel, her eyes dancing with excitement. He accepted it with a nod, his hands trembling, not from the cold this time, but from the unexpected warmth of being cared for. Samuel looked at her, seeing a spark of something so pure and familiar that it ached. "Thank you, Amara. Tell your mother I'm grateful." Amara smiled, a missing tooth making her grin all the more endearing. "I will. But first, tell me a story, please." She settled next to him, pulling her coat tighter around her small frame. The city's noise seemed to soften, as if waiting for Samuel to begin. He looked out into the distance, his eyes unfocused as memories swirl. "Once there was a little bird carved from the finest wood," he started, his voice low and steady. "It wasn't the fanciest, but it was crafted with love, and this bird could only fly if someone believed it could." Amara's eyes widened with wonder as Samuel's voice carried the tale, weaving images of resilience, loss, and hope. The story ended with the bird soaring at last, not because it gained wings, but because it was lifted by the wind of kindness. Amara clapped, the sound sharp and joyful. "I knew it could fly," she said, glancing at the carved bird in his pocket. A few neighbors, drawn by the gentle storytelling, lingered nearby, their expressions softening. They didn't hear all the words, but they caught enough to remember that this man, Samuel, was not just another silent face on the corner. He was a part of their lives now, even if only in the smallest ways. One stormy evening, Samuel noticed Jasmine walking briskly, her arms loaded with bags. She glanced up at the darkening sky, her brow creased with worry. Samuel shifted, about to call out, when he saw Amara not far behind, struggling to keep up and slipping on patches of ice. Before he could react, a commotion erupted from across the street. A car skidding on black ice, its driver's frantic face visible even from a distance. The tires squealed, a warning of danger about to strike. Samuel's heart pounded as he moved with a speed he hadn't known he still possessed. He reached Amara just in time, scooping her up and spinning away as the car careened into a parked vehicle, the crash echoing through the night. For a breathless moment, there was silence. Then shouts and hurried footsteps broke the stillness as people rushed to the scene. Jasmine reached them, eyes wide with fear and relief. She dropped her bags, reaching for her daughter and hugging her fiercely. Samuel stood a step back, breathless, his hands shaking from more than the cold. You saved her. Again, Jasmine said, her voice breaking. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she turned to him, her gratitude deeper than words could capture. The incident drew more than just attention. It sparked action. Neighbors who once walked past Samuel without a glance now paused, leaving warm drinks and words of thanks. A few of the shopkeepers even pooled resources to offer him temporary shelter at night. It was a gesture Samuel never expected, but accepted with humble nods, feeling the layers of his solitude peel away with each day. But the newfound attention also brought whispers, ones that carried questions about Samuel's past. Some were curious, others judgmental. Why was a man like him out here to begin with? They asked. And Samuel knew it wouldn't be long before those questions became more pointed. He hadn't told anyone about his past, not about the small woodworking shop he'd once owned, now replaced by a gleaming storefront, nor about the family he'd lost, piece by painful piece. But with the neighborhood's attention now firmly on him, Samuel felt the pressure of the truth pressing against the fragile walls he had built around it. Amara, sensing the change in Samuel's demeanor, visited more often, her chatter about school and drawings filling the silences that grew heavier with each passing day. One day, she handed him a piece of paper with careful, colorful scribbles. "It's you and me?" she explained, pointing to the stick figures under a bright sun. Samuel's eyes watered as he looked at the simple drawing. He could barely speak, the lump in his throat made thicker by a long-forgotten feeling, belonging. But Samuel knew that storms weren't always made of wind and snow. Some were made of pasts that refused to be forgotten and secrets that refused to stay hidden. The days after the accident became a blur of conversations and whispered stories. People stopped by Samuel's usual spot, now less a corner of forgotten shadows and more a meeting point where words of gratitude and small gestures were exchanged. The bakery owner, a stern-faced man named Mr. Alvarez, who seldom engaged with anyone, even offered Samuel a warm loaf each morning with a nod that spoke volume. But with warmth came whispers, questions that scratched at old wounds Samuel had tried to ignore. The children called him Guardian Grandpa, their voices ringing with admiration, but the adults murmured about the man he once was. A few even remembered him from years ago, before life had bent him low. One evening, as Samuel carved a small toy bird under the dimming sky, a figure approached. Jasmine stood there, the light from a street lamp casting her in a soft glow. Her eyes were weary, as if carrying questions too heavy to bear alone. "Samuel, would you mind if I sit?" she asked. He gestured to the spot beside him, and she settled in, wrapping her coat tighter around herself. "I need to ask you something," Jasmine began, her voice gentle but firm. "Amara adores you, and I can see why. But people are talking, and I realized I don't know much about you." She paused, searching his face for any hint of resentment or discomfort. Samuel exhaled, the breath visible in the frosty air. He set down the carving, looking at his rough, calloused hands. "What do they say?" His voice was quiet, resigned. "That you were once a craftsman, that you had a family," Jasmine said, each word deliberate. A shadow crossed Samuel's eyes, a flicker of pain that spoke of memories still raw. He nodded slowly. "It's true. I had a workshop. I built toys, furniture, anything people needed. And I had a daughter, too. Her name was Elise." Jasmine's breath caught, sensing the story that was about to spill from him. "After her mother passed, it was just the two of us. The shop was everything to me, but in the end, it wasn't enough." He swallowed hard, as if each word were a splinter. "A debt collector came one winter. I lost the shop, and soon after, Elise. Social services said I couldn't provide for her." His voice faltered, and he clenched his jaw, holding back a tide of emotion. "I haven't seen her since." Jasmine's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Samuel, I'm so sorry." Samuel nodded, unable to look at her. "That's why I couldn't stand by and watch Amara be hurt. I couldn't fail again, not when I had the power to act." Winter's harsh grip only tightened. Samuel's story spread like the crackle of a fire catching dry wood. It drew attention not just from neighbors, but from those who had once crossed paths with him. One of them was Marta, a social worker with gray hair tied back in a no-nonsense bun, who remembered the day she had to take Elise from her father. One afternoon, Marta visited the alley where Samuel stayed. When he looked up and saw her, recognition flared in his eyes, followed by a guarded wariness. "Samuel," she said, her voice steady but tinged with regret. "I never expected to find you here." He didn't reply at first. The carved bird clutched tightly in his fist. Finally, he spoke, his tone flat. "Life surprises us that way, doesn't it? I came because I heard about what you did for that little girl. I always wondered what happened to you after Elise," Marta said, stepping closer. "There might be a way to find her, you know." Samuel's heart thudded painfully, caught between hope and disbelief. He had spent so many nights imagining Elise grown, picturing her eyes, dark like her mother's, wide like his own, haunted by the guilt that he'd failed her. But now, after years of accepting the numbness of his loneliness, the idea of reaching out felt both like salvation and punishment. The storm came as if to test the entire neighborhood's mettle. It was a night when the wind howled and snow piled thick against doors, trapping people inside. But Jasmine knew Samuel was out there somewhere, and that knowledge gnawed at her. Without hesitation, she bundled Amara in blankets and pushed open their door against the icy gale. Other neighbors, moved by Samuel's story and recent heroism, joined her in the search. They called out into the dark, their voices whipped away by the wind, carrying only fragments of Samuel's name. Mr. Alvarez, with his thick coat and gruff demeanor, led the search down the narrow alleys where Samuel had made his home. When they finally found him, Samuel was hunched against a wall, shivering but clutching the drawing Amara had given him as if it were his lifeline. Jasmine rushed to him, tears freezing on her cheeks. "Samuel, we're taking you home." He blinked, disoriented, eyes finding hers and then Amara's, who peered out from her mother's embrace. Samuel's lips parted, a faint smile breaking through his exhaustion. "I told you, the bird could fly," he whispered before slipping into unconsciousness. Samuel woke up days later, warmth seeping into him from layers of blankets. The ceiling above him wasn't stone, but wood, painted a soft blue. Amara's voice chattered nearby, telling someone how they had found him. Jasmine appeared, relief etched into her features as she noticed him stirring. "You're safe," she said, her voice quivering. "We're all safe." Tears welled in Samuel's eyes, for the first time not from sorrow, but from the sharp ache of gratitude. But the storm had brought more than the cold. It had rekindled connections and brought forth the whispers of a daughter who might be closer than he dared believe. The days following the storm brought a new rhythm to Samuel's life. The neighborhood had embraced him as one of their own, offering shelter and food, ensuring that the man who had protected one of their children was never alone in the cold again. Samuel found himself in Jasmine's home, sharing meals with her and Amara, who would sit by his side, eyes wide with wonder as he carved small wooden figures for her. But as warmth seeped into Samuel's bones, so did the sharp sting of memories long buried. Every time Amara giggled or asked a question, a shadow of Elise flickered in his mind. He had always wondered what had become of his daughter, whether she'd grown up resenting him or thinking he had forgotten her. The uncertainty gnawed at him, a splinter that wouldn't dislodge. One evening, Jasmine entered the small room she had set up for Samuel, a folded piece of paper clutched in her hand. Her expression was cautious, almost apprehensive. "Samuel," she began, sitting beside him, "there's something you need to see." She handed him the paper. It was a letter, worn at the edges and marked with ink smudges, as if read and reread. Samuel unfolded it with trembling fingers and scanned the words. His breath caught as the world seemed to tilt. "To anyone who finds my father, Samuel, the woodcarver, please tell him that I've been searching for him for years. I never gave up hope. If you see him, let him know that his daughter, Elise, still loves him. He can reach me at the address below." Samuel's vision blurred, the neatly printed letters swimming in front of him. The room fell silent except for the soft ticking of the clock. "Where? How did you get this?" His voice was barely above a whisper, choked with disbelief. Jasmine reached out, her hand resting lightly on his. "Marta, the social worker, brought it over after the storm. She remembered your story and reached out to colleagues who had tried to track you down over the years. Elise has been trying to find you, Samuel." Samuel's heart pounded as hope and fear collided inside him. He had spent so many years assuming she had forgotten, or worse, despised him. To know she had searched all this time was a gift he wasn't sure he deserved. The community gathered that night, an impromptu gathering sparked by the news that had trickled down the streets. They brought lanterns and blankets, forming a circle in Jasmine's living room and spilling out into the front yard, sharing stories of the man they had come to see as a guardian and friend. Amara climbed onto Samuel's lap, oblivious to the adults' serious faces. "Grandpa Samuel, will you tell us another story?" Her voice was pure, cutting through the tension and reminding everyone why they were there. He smiled, a tear slipping down his cheek as he kissed her curly head. "Yes, little one. This time, I'll tell you a story about finding what you thought you'd lost forever." The room quieted, and Samuel began to speak. His voice, though still hoarse, carried strength as he recounted moments of his life he hadn't dared share until now. The joy of his daughter's birth, the bitter nights after losing her, and the hope that had kept him carving small wings even when it felt foolish. Jasmine squeezed his hand as he spoke, her eyes reflecting not just pity but admiration. This man, who had once been reduced to shadows, was now the centerpiece of their shared story, a testament to the strength that had lived among them unnoticed. The real challenge came the following week. Samuel, flanked by Jasmine and Marta, stood at the door of a small, warmly lit apartment. His heart raced, the carved bird in his pocket, now a talisman of courage. He could barely breathe as the door opened. Elise stood there, her face older but unmistakably familiar. Her hair was pulled back, dark curls cascading down her back, and her eyes, his eyes, widened with recognition and disbelief. "Papa?" The word trembled out of her, a mix of hope, pain, and something else Samuel couldn't quite place. He nodded, unable to trust his voice. Tears brimmed in his eyes, blurring the daughter he'd lost and found in the same heartbeat. Before he could move, Elise stepped forward, wrapping him in an embrace that spoke of years spent waiting, nights spent wondering, and the overwhelming relief that the search was over. "I thought I lost you forever," Samuel whispered, his voice breaking. The carved bird slipped from his fingers and fell between them, unnoticed. Elise pulled back just enough to look into his face, her eyes full of love and forgiveness. "I found you, Papa. I never gave up." The room seemed to exhale as the past released its grip, and Samuel, for the first time in decades, felt whole. But he knew that healing was not a single moment. It was a journey, one he was finally ready to take, with Elise by his side. The reunion with Elise brought Samuel a rush of joy so profound that it frightened him. For days they talked, catching up on years lost to silence. Elise shared stories of her life, her struggles in foster care, the kindness of strangers who became family, and her eventual journey to becoming a teacher. She spoke with both pride and lingering sadness, a balance Samuel recognized in himself. But not all reunions were seamless. Old wounds hovered like ghosts. One evening, as they sat together in the soft glow of a lamp, Samuel watched Elise's face, now caught between shadows and light. "Why didn't you look for me, Papa?" she asked, the question soft but weighted. It landed like a stone in the quiet room. Samuel's breath caught, the question he had feared most now spoken aloud. He looked down at his hands, once steady, now trembling. "I did, at first. But after losing everything, the shop, our home, I didn't know how to start over. I thought you'd be better off, that I'd failed you beyond repair." Elise's eyes shone with unshed tears, a mix of anger and empathy. "I needed you even then. I needed to know you hadn't given up." The silence that followed was dense with all that had been left unspoken for years. Samuel reached into his pocket, fingers brushing the carved bird. "I never stopped thinking about you, Elise. This," he said, holding out the small wooden figure, "was always for you. I carved it during the darkest nights when hope felt like a lie I couldn't afford." Elise took the bird, her fingers closing around it as though it were a lifeline. The room shifted, the shared pain loosening its hold just enough to let light seep through the cracks. The community felt the ripple of change. Samuel's transformation from a man alone in the cold to a father, reunited with his daughter, inspired stories that spread through the neighborhood. Children who once watched him from afar now crowded around to listen to his stories, eager for tales about birds that could fly when hope lifted them. Jasmine, who had become a sister-like figure to Elise and an anchor for Samuel, organized a neighborhood gathering to celebrate the reunion. They set up long tables adorned with mismatched cloths and dishes brought from homes up and down the block. Candles flickered in mason jars, casting warm, dancing shadows that defied the chill in the air. Amara ran up to Samuel, tugging on his sleeve. "Grandpa Samuel, come sit by us!" Her eyes sparkled, her voice bright enough to draw smiles from everyone nearby. Samuel followed, his heart swelling as he watched Elise laugh with Jasmine and Amara. The carved bird sat on the table, a small, silent witness to the miracle that had unfolded. But the evening was not without its test. As neighbors gathered and shared stories of resilience and hope, a man stood on the periphery, watching with a sharp gaze. He was dressed in a worn coat, the kind that suggested hardship, but there was something more, a familiarity that made Samuel's chest tighten. The man stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Samuel," he called, drawing all eyes to him. "You don't remember me, do you?" The room stilled. Samuel squinted, recognition dawning slowly. "Marcus?" His voice held a note of disbelief. Marcus had been a friend once, back when life was simpler and the shop was filled with laughter and the scent of fresh pine. But Marcus had also been there at the end, when debts overtook friendship and betrayal had cut deeper than poverty. "I heard you were back," Marcus said, his voice lined with both guilt and relief. "I came to say I'm sorry for everything." A murmur spread through the crowd as Samuel's hand tightened on the table's edge. Years of resentment rose in his chest, bitter and sharp. But then he glanced at Elise, who watched him with an expression of quiet strength, and at Amara, whose innocent trust mirrored hope. Samuel drew a long breath. "We both paid our prices, didn't we?" The words felt heavy, yet liberating. "Let's leave the past where it belongs." Marcus nodded, tears gathering in his eyes. The moment was raw, its forgiveness imperfect, but real. And as Samuel sat back, the tension eased, and conversations resumed with a renewed energy, as if the whole room had exhaled. The night closed with a simple toast. Jasmine stood, raising her glass. "To new beginnings," she said, her eyes meeting Samuel's, "and to the strength it takes to come back to where you started." Samuel raised his own, the carved bird resting in front of him like a promise kept. "And to those who make us believe that flight is always possible." Elise reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "Together, Papa," she whispered. "Together," he echoed, his voice breaking softly. The days that followed the gathering felt like a season of spring breaking through the frost of a long, hard winter. Samuel spent most afternoons in Jasmine's yard, surrounded by the children of the neighborhood who came to hear his stories and watch him carve small animals and birds from blocks of wood. Amara was always at his side, asking questions and offering suggestions, her laughter ringing out like chimes in the wind. Elise visited often, bringing Samuel into her world with hesitant steps. She showed him photos of her life, of friends who had been like family when he wasn't there. Each picture was a silent reminder of moments missed, but also a testament to her resilience. Samuel felt pride mingled with regret, but with each day, it shifted more towards peace. One afternoon, Elise brought a surprise. "I found this in a box at home," she said, handing him an old photo. It showed Samuel at his workbench, hair dark and face young, with Elise as a little girl perched on his knee, her small hands holding a carved bird just like the one he kept in his pocket. Samuel's eyes misted over, the years folding back on themselves as he traced the outlines of the past. "I thought this was lost," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Elise placed a hand on his arm, her touch warm and grounding. "It wasn't," she said softly. "Just like us." The neighborhood had grown fond of their guardian grandpa. Mr. Alvarez, the once gruff baker, invited Samuel to help in the mornings, teaching him how to knead dough and shape loaves. Samuel laughed at the clumsy attempts, feeling more alive than he had in decades. The bakery's warmth seeped into him, filling gaps left empty for too long. The children begged for more carvings, and soon Samuel's small wooden figures sat in windowsills up and down the block, tiny reminders of courage and kindness. Each time Samuel saw one, a flicker of pride kindled in his chest. He was part of something again, not just a bystander on the fringes, but woven into the fabric of this community. One day, Marta, the social worker who had reconnected him with Elise, stopped by with news. "I wanted you to know, Samuel, that the city has recognized your contributions. They're setting up a small grant to help people in situations like yours get back on their feet." Samuel nodded, gratitude pulling at his heart. The idea of others being helped, people who once felt as invisible as he had, brought a new kind of warmth. But even more significant was knowing he'd be a part of that change, not as a figure of pity, but as a symbol of hope. As winter melted into spring, Samuel stood in front of a small shop on the corner that had been vacant for years. A modest sign in the window read, "Samuel's Workshop, where wings find wind." Elise had helped him draft the name, and now she stood by his side as he unlocked the door for the first time. "Do you think people will come?" Samuel asked, the uncertainty of a man who had long doubted himself. Elise smiled, the expression softening the lines of worry that still lingered on his face. "They already have, Papa. They just don't know it yet." The interior was small but bright, filled with the smell of fresh wood and the faint scent of varnish. Samuel touched the workbench, feeling its solid reassurance beneath his palm. It was like stepping back into an old, beloved chapter of his life. But this time the pages were clean, ready to be written anew. Amara burst through the door, Jasmine following with a laugh. "Grandpa Samuel, can we make more birds today?" Amara's excitement filled the room, driving away the last shadows of doubt. "Yes, little one," Samuel said, his voice steady and warm. "Today, and for as many days as you want." The shop soon buzzed with life, neighbors stopping by to place orders, children learning to sand and shape, and stories shared over the rhythmic rasp of carving tool. Samuel's heart, once wrapped in the numbness of loneliness, now thrived on the connections forged and reforged. That evening, as the sun set behind the city, Samuel sat on the front steps of his shop, the carved bird in his pocket. Elise joined him, her arm slipping through his. The street glowed with the golden light of lanterns as families walked past, waving and calling out greetings. Samuel looked at Elise, seeing the reflection of their shared resilience in her eyes. "I never imagined this," he admitted, a tear slipping free. "Neither did I," Elise said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "But sometimes the best stories are the ones we didn't plan." And as the first stars blinked awake in the darkening sky, Samuel felt it, the weight of loss, lifted at last by the gentle wings of hope. The months that followed were filled with moments Samuel had once only dreamed of. Mornings spent working at his bench with Amara by his side, afternoons full of laughter as the children in the neighborhood came to watch and learn, and evenings sitting with Elise, their conversations stretching late into the night. The shop became a place of stories and shared memories, a testament to second chances and the power of community. One day, as spring began to give way to the first whispers of summer, the neighborhood held a fair. Stalls lined the streets filled with baked goods, crafts, and games. The smell of caramel and fresh bread mixed in the air, and children darted between booths, their laughter lifting into the warm breeze. Samuel set up a small stand outside his workshop, displaying carvings he'd made with Amara's help. Tiny birds, animals, and small boats with intricate sails sat neatly arranged, each piece a labor of love. A crowd gathered, admiring the work, and Samuel found himself caught in the wave of conversations, questions, and kind words. Amara ran up, her hands full of small flowers she'd collected. "Grandpa Samuel, look what I got for you!" She pushed them toward him, beaming. Samuel laughed, a deep sound that felt like sunlight spilling from within. "These are perfect, Amara," he said, tucking a flower behind her ear. The sight of her wide, joyful eyes filled him with a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. Elise approached, a smile playing at her lips. "I have a surprise," she announced, a playful glint in her eye. Samuel raised an eyebrow. "Another one? You're spoiling an old man, you know." She reached into her bag and handed him a photo. Samuel's breath caught as he recognized the faces: Elise, Amara, and Jasmine, all posing together in front of the shop. Above them, the sign read, "Samuel's Workshop, where wings find wind," newly painted and surrounded by the blooming flowers they'd planted in spring. "We thought it would be good to capture this," Elise said, her voice soft, "to remind us that no matter what, we found each other." Samuel's eyes filled with tears as he looked at the photo, his fingers tracing the outlines. He swallowed, feeling the lump in his throat dissolve into a smile. "Thank you, Elise. I never thought I'd have something like this again." Jasmine joined them, wrapping an arm around Elise and nodding at Samuel. "You deserve this, Samuel. We all do." The day drew to a close, the fair winding down as the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet. Samuel stood outside his shop, watching as lanterns were lit, their soft glow casting golden light across the cobblestone. Amara tugged at his hand, pointing to the sky. "Look, Grandpa Samuel, the first star." He glanced up, following her gaze. The stars sparkled above them, small and bright, a reminder of how light finds its way into even the darkest places. "Make a wish," Elise whispered, leaning close. Samuel closed his eyes, the carved bird warm in his pocket, and breathed in the cool summer night air. For the first time, he didn't wish for things lost. Instead, he wished for moments like this to last, a life filled with laughter, love, and the shared hope that bound them all together. When he opened his eyes, he met Elise's knowing smile and nodded. "I don't have to," he said, squeezing her hand. "I already have everything I need." The street grew quieter, families returning to their homes, their voices drifting away like a song at its final note. Samuel stood with Elise and Amara, watching the lanterns sway gently, their flames steady against the night. The carved bird rested in his pocket, a silent testament to the story that had found its end not in loss, but in rediscovery. It was a story that spoke not only of flight, but of finding one's way back home, carried on the wings of hope. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to HeroKind Stories for more tales that warm the heart and remind us of the power of kindness. Don't forget to leave a comment about what touched you most, and share this story with a friend who could use a reminder of hope. Click on the next video for more inspiring journeys.